Good afternoon. Today is the 15th of January. It's unfortunately a little bit on the dark side in here, but I want to quickly make this very vague vlog. Unfortunately, I'm going to be sitting in the car today to do this rather than driving, because I need to tell you about the 10 most difficult cars I've found to drive on the entire channel. So having done something like 450 to 500 reviews over the course of many years, I have driven a lot of cars, an awful lot of them. I think I've driven more than Mr. Richardson and Furious Driving or something like that. It's something enormous number of cars, and some of them are more difficult than others. I'm going to put this in the order that I think is the most difficult to drive. You will probably think I am an absolute idiot and I cannot drive anything at all once you've heard some of this list. If so, please just keep that to yourself. I'm already telling you that I'm an idiot. You don't have to say that as well. I'm not particularly good at driving the old cars. I don't really want to own really old cars because they're so difficult to drive. The biggest problem I have is generally really heavy steering or really dreadful gearboxes, or sometimes appalling brakes. Some cars, I'll tell you actually, that weren't on this list. Amazingly, the 1964 Austin 1100. I didn't find that car particularly difficult to drive. It doesn't have a brake servo and there's no synchromesh on first. And yet I was okay with that one. Amazingly, there are some other cars in that particular collection we'll come on to later. First, some honourable mentions. One would be Mr. Coleman's 1982 Ford Granada Mark II GXXX Estate. That's a 5-speed manual factory car. It's very rare actually to find a 2.8 GXXX Granada that's not an automatic, and yet this one was a 5-speed factory manual. It was ordered by one of the people in his family from New as a manual, and unfortunately, if you are rubbish at driving like I am, it's quite easy to actually sort of cause problems with things like the drive shafts, which I did. I wore up the drive shaft coupling because my gear changing is so bad. Next, we have the 1979 Chrysler Avenger, which I drove at the Great British Car Journey last year. That was okay until I had problems changing gear. And this is a common theme, but we'll go all the way through the video. I am rubbish at changing gear in older cars. And please do not tell me, oh, you just need a bit more practice and just don't rush it. That's not what's happened. And when you kind of are in this situation where you're driving on a public road, you're trying to talk intelligently, you try not to hit anything, it's very difficult actually when you're talking to the camera and sometimes you've got the owner in the car with you to not mess things up in terms of things like the gear changing and things like that. It's just sometimes very hard. Like it looks easy, but it's not. I can assure you it's not. Even so, like Mr. Richardson and Furious Driving, Ian Seabrook from Hubnut and Stefan Driver Classic, they have problems with driving cars sometimes as well. It's not just me, although I think compared to the three of them, I'm particularly bad. But anyway, Mr. Coleman wasn't amused when he had to put a new drive shaft coupling in his Granada. That's why I don't really touch that one anymore. Next, the Avenger. The problem with the Avenger is that the gearbox is not biased around third. Like the car I'm sitting in today, the third gear is straight in front of neutral. In a Chrysler Avenger, it's not. It's actually to the side, and the gearbox is biased around first. A lot of old 4-speed gearboxes are biased around first, and if you forget that when you're driving, it can be an absolute pain, as I found out. Apart from that, that's not a bad car to drive. It's just the the gearbox, hence that's why it's not actually in the list. The Vauxhall Viva, 1972 Vauxhall Viva, that Mr. Richardson also drove recently, the Great British Car Journey, but I drove it about 11 months before he did. That one is just not particularly nice to drive. The Vauxhall Chevette that I drove back in September is very similar, identical engine and gearbox. Well, the Chevette's got servo-assisted brakes, and I think it's got disc on the front. The Viva I drove, it was 72. It didn't have servo assistance, and the brakes were all drums. The most amazing thing was not the terrible brakes, it was the body lean, which Mr. Richardson said was all right, but when I drove it, I found it... Apologies, viewers, my mount seems to be regularly falling off the windscreen during videos at the moment. When I drove that Vauxhall Viva, it leant over like a listing ship at 15 miles an hour. So, yeah, not the best handling car ever. The Chevette was a little bit better, but they're not great cars. We're still not on the top 10 yet. Then there's the Austin 1300 GT that was okay in comparison with the earlier 64 1100 that actually had servo-assisted brakes and actually synchromesh first gear, but I still could not fathom why the gearbox was so bad at it. A lot of other people who've driven that car also say for some reason that particular car, where it's been fully restored, the gearbox is really bad in it. I don't know why. Then there was a Fiat 127. Now, a Fiat 127 doesn't have servo-assisted brakes. But the problem I have with it is not the brakes. I somehow managed to drive it, okay? It wasn't the gearbox. I managed to actually conquer that somehow, though you hear some pretty nasty noises when I'm revving it to try to go up a hill and coming out of a junction. That was difficult. It was starting it after I'd actually filmed the static part of the review. It just didn't quite want to start. Eventually it did, but actually that was not a bad car. Again, it's something Mr. Richardson Fury is driving, also drove, but I drove it before him, so there we go. That's just what happens sometimes. Sometimes you get there first, sometimes you get there second. It just what happens when you're reviewing cars. We'll go on to the actual top 10 now. So number 10 is the 1976 Datsun 260Z. This car had one of my pet hates, it was fixed seatbelts. I absolutely detest fixed seatbelts. They are the biggest pain in the world. And because the owner had had the car since 1990, he just left them. The first thing I would have done is throw those seatbelts out. The car itself was a little bit tricky to drive. It's not the easiest gearbox and clutch in one of those, but the fixed seatbelts meant it was just horrendous in terms of actually trying to kind of just reach for controls. Even changing gear was hard. And ninth place, something that I was expecting to be a bit easier, the 1968 Austin 1800 Mark II. Same owner as the 1100 and also another car we're going to get to on this list. That, for some reason, again, fixed seatbelts. Fixed seatbelts, and I don't know why, the gear change was really reluctant. All synchromesh gearbox, unlike the 1100, but just not a very nice change. I don't know why. It just not a very easy clutch either. I think I'm visibly struggling in that video to actually drive it. I managed, but it was hard. It wasn't easy at all. I think because the car hadn't been started for a while, we started it up, and then I drove it quite soon after it was fully warmed up, and so that's probably why. But it wasn't the easiest car I've ever driven. The 1100 was a lot nicer. Then we have the 1985 Austin Maestro 1.6 Vanden Plas automatic. Now you'd think that something like this, it's, you know, just under 40 years old, it shouldn't be too bad, but the problem with this car was the steering. the steering was stupidly heavy. I don't know how to describe it other than it was just absolutely awful. A lot of the you know, later Maestros, if you're going for a luxurious trim level, like a 2-litre MG Maestro I drove, was a 91, and also some of the later Vanden Plas had standard power steering in them, but an automatic Maestro without power steering, you need like the sort of muscles of Hulk Hogan to turn the wheel in it. I found that to be a pain. Once you're moving, it's okay, but the steering was so heavy in that. I just couldn't believe it. But yeah, the ones that aren't automatic are a bit lighter, and so it's a bit easier. I've driven a couple of 1.6 manual Maestros without power steering, and they're okay. But 1.3 is even better because the engine's lighter, but my gosh, that was bad. The later Vanden Plas did have power steering, and if I was to have one of those, I would need power steering in my Maestro. On the same veins, the 1987 Volkswagen Polo Mark II 1.3 Ranger, that didn't just have the heaviest steering I've ever encountered in any manual car. It also had non-servo brakes. Volkswagen did not fit servo-assisted brakes to Mark II Polos until the facelift in 1990 in right-hand drive. Left-hand drive, yes. Right-hand drive, no. The brakes are absolutely and utterly appalling. I was terrified in that because the gentleman who owns that car has had it from new, and when I drove it in 2021, it was also raining. It was absolutely and utterly atrocious in terms of the driving. You'd think a little car like that would be really easy, but it wasn't. It was awful. The thing is, in my family, we had tons and tons of Mark II Polos when I was younger, all pre-facelift ones. I don't know how my father managed. He did one of those as well, and then childminder had one, and she's an only little lady. She used to sort of, you know, kind of practice her push-pull steering all the time. But yeah, surprisingly difficult car to drive. I couldn't wait to get that back. It had damaged it. Next, another car from the same owner as the 1800, the 1968 Triumph Herald 1360. I suspect this one, it would have been better had there not actually been 1.5 engine in it. Again, another one of these cars with no servo assistance for the brakes and no synchromesh on first gear. A pattern's kind of emerging here, which we'll see as we come towards the top of the list. And it was really bad. I kind of coped with it, but it was pretty bad. I mean, I thought I was going to crash at one point in that car. And also my mount fell off the windscreen, just like it did today. So that was wonderful. Next, the 1972 Hillman Imp. Great British Car Journey in January. I know, yes, Steph, my driver classic, has driven that, so loads of other people, and have I. And it wasn't the brakes this time, it was the problem. It was the gearbox. The gearbox just had the nastiest selection I've ever heard. I mean, I've heard different things. Some people say the gearboxes are always just bad in them. They're just bad. And other people have said one that you drove, you've had a broken clutch or something. I'm not sure the clutch is broken in that car, otherwise they would have fixed it. But it could just be that I can't change gear properly. As you know, you're probably thinking, I'm going through this list, that that's just always been the way. But yeah, I didn't really get on with that car very well. Number 4, the MGB GT V8 conversion from 1972. What is it about cars in 1972 appearing on this list? There's tons of them. Anyway, that car had sort of like original spec GT V8 gearbox in it, although it had 270 horsepower. And it was just very hard to drive. Like, so much power, you got to be really careful. it bumped around everywhere because the suspension has been changed. The road was quite bad. I kept trying to put it into a non-existent first gear. I actually edited out some of the gear changing because my gear changing was so bad. Eventually, I just basically realised you didn't have to change gear in the car at all. You could put it in fourth and you could pull away. It didn't really matter, but you know, I've driven an MGB before, and that had a later gearbox and a standard four-cylinder in it, and that was a 1981 registered car built in 1980. So it had brake servo. That drive position was better than in the GT, as far as I'm concerned. The seats were better in the later one, and it didn't have like about 1,000,000 times more power. So yeah, that was a struggle. I don't think I'll be trying that one again. Into the top three now, and two of them actually are cars familiar to Alex from the Alex's Assets channel. Third place, the 1961 Rover 100 P4. What is the problem with the P4? Well, there's two problems. It's not the brakes. It's not even the right-hand handbrake. It's the gearbox. Again. Not only, like the Chrysler Avenger, is the gearbox biased around first and second, not third and fourth, which is just unnatural for me. First is where third should be, and reverse is where you think first should be, and it's got no synchromesh on first. So you have to sort of come to junctions in second, or you have to remember where first is, which in a stressful situation, it won't always work. I actually put it in reverse at a roundabout. I can't remember crunching the gears. I might have done, but that was not good. And Alex, who owns a car, she used driving lots of old cars, so Allegro I found a lot easier to drive. Rover P6 that I drove, I found it a lot easier to drive. Yeah, but her Land Rover wasn't so good, but yeah, the P4, I'll leave that one for her to drive, I think. Next, the 1968 MG Midget Mark III. Not only was that almost impossible to get in and out of, but it's got no servo brakes. It does have disc brakes. The brakes weren't actually the problem. And it's got no synchromesh on first. Now, I sort of coped okay with that most of the time, but the car was just crashing over every single bump. It's a really small car as well. The windscreen's about here. And so it just sort of crashed and over every bump, and all the vibrations came through, and it was really cramped, and it was just not very comfortable. Some people really love midgets, but having driven a midget and a B, the B for me is a much better car. I'm surprised I didn't actually die in that midget. I had Alex with me in the passenger seat at the time, and so I was, eventually both of us could have died, but we didn't, and so that's fine. Number one, the 1969 Morris Minor 1000. Let's go through the checklist, shall we? No servo brakes. No disc brakes. All-round drums. Apparently the drums in that car are better than some of them. And, of course, no synchromesh on first. I cannot tell you how utterly terrified I was driving around Maidstone in that car. I kept off all the dual carriageways. I tried to keep away from junctions, but I ended up sort of dribbling over this pedestrian crossing because I didn't think I'd be able to get into first to slow the car down. I knew the brakes were terrible, so I just dribbled on. It was terrifying. Absolutely and utterly terrifying. I was so happy when I got back and threw the keys back at the owner. But I hadn't died. Steering was okay in that. That has quite light steering, actually. But Sterling Moss used to drive those things quite hard. I can only think that technology's kind of improved over the last sort of 55 years since that car was made. So there we go, a bit of a longer video this time, but they are the top 10 cars that I found the most difficult to drive. they're not necessarily bad cars or anything like that. I have problems driving old cars. I just do. And I've driven lots of them and I just continue to have problems. Maybe it's just me being an absolute nincompoop, but yeah, I'm sure some of you also have had your difficulties. So if you're just going to write in the comments, you're an idiot or you need more lessons, or something like that, I don't really want to see those. I'll just remove them. But if you have experiences of driving older cars, which you struggle with as well, then please do share them. Thank you ever so much indeed once again for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and comment below, and we shall see you again soon for hopefully some easier cars to live with.